very easy person to introduce, but he actually almost did the entire introduction. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Jon Guttman to come up and talk about some strange aircraft of World War I. Thank you, John.
I start out having to do a little justifying in regard to the term Frontline Freaks, because when it comes to World War I and the power of being able to look back in retrospect, when one thinks of freakish aircraft of World War I, it's a case of where can you begin? I mean, there are so many. I mean, anyone who remembers the old Colby drawings may have gotten started, as I was, by just looking at some of those and seeing some of the wacky approaches to trying to redefine aircraft at a time when aircraft were just starting to be defined. And then when military objectives are thrown in, you're trying to find some way of accommodating those, and the results are, well, in retrospect, pretty freakish across the board. And everyone probably has his favorite. One of mine used to be the Weymann W1, which was a rather broad fuselaged French design with a rotary engine inside it and the propeller in the back, looking rather inadequate. And all this so that you can put a machine gun up front, and of course it overheated, and of course it was underpowered and overweight, and of course it got nowhere. Or there's the Vendôme or the Dufo. The Vendôme, you have once again a couple of geared rotaries running propellers in the wing, or the Dufo, which has the engine and the propeller between two halves of the fuselage somehow being expected to be held together. But then we tried to do the same thing with one of our float planes. And then you have stuff like, well, a three-wing, why have a triplane when you can have a quadruplane, especially an Euler quadruplane with the fourth wings actually being the ailerons. All sorts of weird stuff coming out. Not to mention those who think big, ultimately leading to the German Riesenflugzeuge, including the three-decker Linke Hoffmann R1, which one of its pilots said was not so much an airplane as a sickness. And then Linke Hoffmann cannot be accused of being anything but original. The next thing they come up with is a Riesenflugzeug with four engines geared into a single propeller. And the thing that took longest for them to produce was the propeller, because it's not exact. At 23 feet, it's not exactly an off-the-shelf item. In fact, the war was over by the time they finished carving it. And these are some of the, you want freaks? You got freaks. Actually, as my brother who wrote about it put it, the Linke Hoffmann R2 looks like a fairly reasonable, conventional airplane, unless you see a photo with people standing next to it and you realize just how big it is. So when we go for Frontline Freaks here, we're talking about some that did the next amazing step. In retrospect, you end up thinking, what were they thinking? And I'll explain what they were thinking. But these actually got into production, and they actually got to see some use. And both happen to be French, and both have an ironic twist at the end, which I'll get to in their turn. The first is the SPAD SA1. This was a product of the 1915 period when people were fooling around with ideas that the best way to fire a machine gun is to have it up front so you can just aim the plane at the target. or at least have the observer in a place where he's got an uninterrupted means of fire. But synchronization, interrupter gear were not in widespread use, and some people were thinking of ways around the problem of a tractor airplane. Louis Bechereau was one of the who had made the transition from Bad Sa1 to SPAD in the wake of the former's bankruptcy, was thinking in those terms in his own way. Now, Bechereau had tried arming a Bad Sa1 TT earlier by mounting a machine gun to fire over the propeller with a fairing in front of it, in front of the observer who was expected to stand up and fire the thing. Well, that turned out to be an aerodynamic accident waiting to happen. So he began to rethink things, and what he rethought was, how about a pulpit? Simple enough, you can just, really was ingeniously simple. You just have a few struts here and a couple of struts here that you can detach to work on the engine. There was also a ball bearing coupling that attached right into the engine, which gave it a certain degree of stability. And it needed it because the engine in question is an 80 horsepower Rhone 9C, 9-cylinder rotary engine. So that added stability would be welcome. And to accommodate the propeller, they carved a bit into the wing to give that some... and what they came up with was a reconnaissance fighter, you might say, with an observer who could fire a Lewis gun or a carbine, or in this case, I believe, a Hotchkiss, any direction he wanted. What was not to like? More important was the airframe, as it turned out. Bechereau had also come up with an idea for a stiffer, more streamlined airframe by having an extra set of struts simply to hold the wires so that they wouldn't vibrate so much, and that cut down on drag. He later added a further support between those inner line of struts. And he had a crank system for working what was then 2 sets of ailerons. And he had himself actually a compact, neat-looking little fighter. Or so it seemed.
Put it on the surface, John.
Click the other button.
Okay, this is a 3 view of its successor. Same design, simply adapted to a 110 horsepower Rhone 9Z engine. And, well, how would the plane work in practice? Well, it was one of the co-designers, Captain Maurice Schlumberger of Escadrille N23, was a great advocate of the plane. They were built, I believe, 147 of all types were built, and they were issued in dribs and drabs to various French escadrilles, including some of the better-known ones, like N3, where Captain Antonin Brocard had one, and Schlumberger flew one until he was killed on November 22nd, 1915, which should give you an idea of what's to come here. The British got a hold of one for evaluation, and even while it was disassembled, one of their people, Major S. Lewis, commander of No. 3 Squadron, and Captain T. O'Brien, after examining a a disassembled one gave this appraisal. The passenger sits in a nacelle fixed in front of the propeller. This gives a perfect field of fire and view. It is about the same speed as the Moran biplane with the same engine, probably rather faster. It probably lands faster. It is harder to get into a small field. It would be expensive in observers if piloted by indifferent pilots. I love the way the British put this. More on that shortly, but they can already see what might be coming here. The French flying officer told me it was easier to fly than either a Moran Parasol or a Nieuport. I consider that it should be tried when reassembled. Instead of a passenger, 5 or 6 machine guns can be fixed in the nacelle and fired from the pilot's seat. It cannot be flown without the equivalent of a passenger's weight in front. Well, I think you got some idea of what the problem is, as Lewis put it so delicately. If a pilot doesn't know what he's doing and there's a nose over, it's not going to go well for the observer. As a matter of fact, a lot of observers were pretty nervous about sitting in one for equally obvious reasons. Actually, the reasons get more obvious when one reads an account given on November 11th, 1915 at Avor, where Escadrille N68 was trying out a couple of its SPAD SA2s. Actually, these were SA1s with 80 horsepower engines, and this was allegedly witnessed, and mind you, who we're dealing with here. We're dealing with an American volunteer in N124 named Bert Hall. But according to him, the first SPADs were powered by an 80 horsepower Roan engine and had a little wicker nacelle out in front of the actual body of the machine where the observer sat and did his fighting. The pilot sat back at the top wing, the ship being a biplane. The front nacelle was attached to the top wing and to the landing carriage. The first one they tried turned over taking off and mashed the observer flat as a flapjack. Everybody on the field tried to argue them out of trying the second one, but nothing would do but a test flight. So a second one was hauled out and 2 Frenchmen hopped in. It was their last hop. The pilot was a friend of mine, and I regretted his death a great deal. His name was Lieutenant Strohmeyer. The machine took off all right, but when Strohmeyer tried to pull it out of a gradual dive, the front nacelle came off and the wings buckled up, and that was the end of the first model SPAD. The design was washed out and a new one was developed. In actuality, like I said, Bert Hall is not the most reliable of sources. Strohmeyer survived, but the gunner, Soldat Michel, was killed. And that pretty much tells you what the problem is for the SPAD SA1 and SA2. Here's another look at the SA2, giving you an idea of how they... You notice also that there's an accommodation for the prop in the landing gear. They thought of everything, didn't they? And here's another example. Believe it or not, the SPADs did have their moments. They did shoot down a couple of aircraft. For example, on May 17, 1916, N73 had just come to the front. They had some on hand. And Caporal Robert Sabatier, with in S31, with his no gunners were available, so he brought another pilot, Caporal Claude Funk Brentano, to man the gun, and they managed to shoot down a German 2-seater. As a matter of fact, they took on 3-to-1 odds. But when the first one went down, the other Germans got nervous, and they were able to chase the rest of them. Funk Brentano was to get one more confirmed victory before he was killed in action 2 months later. Majan is an intriguing name that we haven't been able to place to an exact unit, but that's a That's an example of an S4. The SA4 was simply the SA2 with only the upper aileron with a crank system. The lower aileron had been eliminated. And here's another of the SA4s. And here's a good view of the lowered observer's pit. And here's an example of why the plane just wouldn't cut it. This is what happens when one has a nose over. And you can see why the observers were nervous. It just wasn't a very safe plane in itself. The SA3 had an even crazier idea behind it. Just in case, why don't we rig by cables a dual control system? Mind you, everything has to go via the landing gear struts. But the idea was to have dual control as well as an optional rear firing machine gun for the pilot. Like that's going to work. It didn't get beyond the prototype stage. Here's the SA4. The main difference, as you can see, is primarily that there's only an upper aileron. The Russians, who had a 600-mile front to cover and not very much aircraft to cover it, and not much in the way of fighters, when they heard that the French had a fighter, they were interested. And they ended up ordering more than 200 SA2s and SA4s. This is one of them. Oddly enough, this one has skis up front, but none for the tail skid. And this is one, the Russians often did some ingenious custom work of their own. This one has a Browning machine gun, which is not uncommon on Russian SPAD A4s. But he's also devised his own electric belt feed to automatically feed the weapon and take care of the spent rounds, which is unusual. Incidentally, needless to say, the observer on a SPAD, any of these SPAD two-seaters, had to have a bag to gather the spent cartridges, because otherwise they were going to go into that radial and that rotary engine, and you figure out what that would do if that were to happen. Okay, here's how to make lemonade out of a lemon. As I mentioned earlier, Becheros had incorporated some very sound ideas into the airframe, and when the French began to explore the idea of mounting 3 machine guns in the nacelle to take up the weight of the observer, remotely fired by the pilot as a single-seater, well, that didn't really work very well. But about that time, interrupter gear was being developed not only by Fokker and Schneider and Moran, but by Mark Burkheit of SPAD, Hispano-Suiza, had worked up one for SPAD. And so SPAD redesigned the basic airframe around interrupter gear and a single Vickers machine gun. And what evolved from it, you can see the family resemblance, at least in the airframe. What difference do you really see with the tailplane or the wings? It evolved into the SPAD 7, which was one of the soundest fighter designs of the war. Conventional, but there's no arguing with success. The plane was still good in 1918. Above all, there's that wing form, which was relatively drag cheating for the time, mainly because of the way it allowed you might say 1.5 bay. This was a very thin set of struts that were simply there to hold the wires halfway through so they wouldn't vibrate, and this cut down on drag. It made the plane very fast for its day, and very successful, although Bert Hall was out of N-124 by the time it got its SPADs. So one Frontline Freak works its way into one rather conventional winner. Then we have another of those, a similar twist with an even more bizarre look to it. The Salmson 1A3 SM1. One of the most underrated manufacturers of the war was Emil Salmson, who had gotten together in 1910 with Georges Canton and Georges Genet, two engineers from Le Havre. Salmson, up till then, had made his living manufacturing pumps. But they came up with a winning radial engine. Now, this isn't a rotary. The cylinders are stationary, and in fact, the engine is water-cooled. But it was very reliable, and after having come up with an 80-horsepower 7-cylinder one in 1911, they had a 120-horsepower 9-cylinder version. They opened up a factory at Billancourt, and builders such as Voisin, Breguet, and Russia's Anatra firm were among the many that were ordering Salmson engines and later building them under license. Well, I guess it's only a matter of time before Salmson gets the idea of wanting to build an airplane around it. And the man he had aid him was René Moineau, who had been a pilot and engineer with Breguet. At the time, the French wanted a new two-seater reconnaissance plane, or corps d'armée. They also had been coming up with the idea of a 3-seat reconnaissance plane designed to penetrate deep and fight your way out, with at least 2 positions holding machine guns. You may be familiar with some of the recon planes that were used for this, the Caudron R4, the Latour 1 through 5, and the Caudron R11, which to various degrees were pretty successful. Well, Salmson and Moineau came up with an idea that, if nothing else, was an imaginative way to do it more economically. They would give a 2-prop 3-passenger plane with 1 engine. A single 260 horsepower Salmson Canton Une 9Z would be sitting in the middle of the fuselage under those louvers you'd seen earlier, and through 2 shafts would be run out by means of gears to power 2 propellers with 1 engine. Nowadays, they'd probably be called a downright green idea. This gives you an idea of how the and this gives you a better of how, in practice, the shafts and gears were set up, and what seemed like a streamlined propeller suspended between an X-shaped set of struts. Certainly looks sturdy enough. You'll note the fuel tank is down there, where it is unlikely to roast the pilot. The pilot is sitting just behind the wing, a gunner behind him and an observer, and gunner is nestled among the radiators up front. Another close-up of the shaft arrangement into the engine. So what could possibly go wrong with a plane like that, besides the fact that 1 engine is trying through a series of gears and shafts, any of which is an accident waiting to happen, to power 2 propellers and lift 3 crewmen off the ground. Oh, and there was also a big wheel up front, which was just in case to prevent nose-overs on landing, but which the pilot was told he was to avoid landing on if possible. Now, the pilot himself is supposed to do this while he is several feet above the ground with all of that engine and flat fuselage and observer and wing in front of him. How much of a view has he got? Not much, especially when it comes to taking off, and that flat fuselage is in front of him. Nevertheless, it's believed as many as 140 SM1A3s were built, and most of the time they were simply handed out in, once again, in small parcels to Escadrille F2, 19, 41, AR-43, F-45, F-58, F-63, 71, 72, 219, 223, and 289. But it's possible that a few 1945 and 58 were actually fully equipped with them for a while. There's certainly at least 3 of them in this picture of F-58, which gives us an idea of the plane in frontline service. There were also, when F-229, which was said to have 10 on strength in early 1917, when it was combined with C-106, the resulting unit was designated SM-106 in some documents. By August 1917, there were 32 of them at the front, in addition to which 2 had been sent to the Russians for evaluation, and given the situation on the Russian front, it's very possible that they were pressed into service. But in practice, they seem to have been universally disliked by their crews. Here's an example of one in F-58 or SM-658, if you will, with the rooster emblem on the fuselage. And another look at the engine arrangement. Well, besides the few that were lost in action, and German Lieutenant Pfeiffer was credited with one, of Jasta 9 was credited with one in May 1917. But the photographic record reveals an awful lot of crack-ups, nose-overs, misfortunes. Some of them pretty serious, but others, the sheer number of them give me the impression that in many cases they were occurring accidentally on purpose, and that the disgusted crews were, some of the time, were just trying to use them up. And yet, as late as March 1918, when Escadrille 289 was formed, Lieutenant Castex, who had been brought over there from AR-58, which had re-equipped with ARs, when it was split to form AR-289, Castex brought what is probably the last operational SM-1 with him, and is said to have soldiered on in it for about a month before it was finally withdrawn. Meanwhile, when it came to France's continuing hunt for a halfway decent reconnaissance plane, Salmson did just what SPAD did. His next design would go the completely conventional route. In fact, the only thing he recovered from the SM-1 was the 9Z engine, which was perfectly good. His next design, based on experience with license producing the Sopwith 1A2, better known as the 1.5 strutter, he came up with something larger and more sturdy, much more sturdy. It was the Salmson 1A3, a perfectly regular looking plane, except for its unbalanced rudder. It's about as conventional an airplane as it gets. Standard ailerons, pilot in front of the observer. They do have a fuel tank in between them, which interferes with communication. That's about the only fault anyone could find with the plane. The fuel tank itself had foam rubber in it, so that if a bullet went, and wire mesh, so if a bullet went through, even an incendiary bullet, it would be put out and it would contain leaks. So it was one of the safer aircraft of the war. This specimen was recently delivered to the 91st Aero Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Service. They were not invincible. This one fell into German hands late in the war. But for the most part, Salmsons did very well. And as a matter of fact, their performance was so good that some Americans started to use them as if they were Bristol fighters, and if Germans tried to interfere with their recon work, they took on a make-my-day stance. The most notable example being Lone Star Bill Irwin, who flew this particular plane with the 1st Aero Squadron and was credited with a total of 8 victories. And one of his gunners, Arthur Easterbrook, was credited with 6. The 91st Aero Squadron produced 3 5-victory aces, which are, by the way, going to be covered in my next Osprey book, which deals with reconnaissance and bomber aces. Plug.
Shameless.
Had to get that in. But this particular plane was to survive the war, and the French were to use it into the 1920s, and rightly so. It was everything the SM-1 wasn't, most of all, successful. So here again is a case of a lemon, well, pretty much going back to the drawing board, you can make lemonade out of that one. But both of these classics emerged from the detritus of a couple of those intriguing fighting freaks that we described. 2 who did make it to the front line were withdrawn and replaced by 2 others that did. And hopefully in future I may bring up some more intriguing cases, but the one thing that marks these is that even the freaks were at least for some time operational and did have their moments, brief though they were. Anyway, at this point I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you, John.